In a small town, people woke up and realized something was wrong. No one could speak. Not after a scream, not after a prayer. The first thing to disappear was a simple morning yawn. Mouths opened, lungs filled, but sound died somewhere inside the throat. And the longer the bell rang at night, the more people lost their voices by morning. The bell itself began to crack, as if it were too full of something it was never meant to hold. The records denied it. The church ignored it. But the town understood one thing too late. Their voices were not gone. They were being collected. And when the bell finally broke, everyone believed it was over. That was the worst mistake they could make. The first thing to vanish was not a scream, but a yawn. At dawn, a baker opened his mouth to greet the street and released nothing but breath, pale and useless in the cold air. The sound died before it was born, swallowed somewhere behind his teeth, as if the night had reached into his throat and taken something that did not belong to it. He tried again, forcing his lungs to work harder, jaw stretching until it ached. Yet only silence spilled out, thin and humiliating. He tasted metal and flour and fear, all at once. Across the street, a woman laughed without sound, shoulders shaking, face folding into the shape of joy while the world remained deaf to it. By midday, the town sounded wrong. Carts rattled too loudly, wheels striking cobblestone with an indecent sharpness. Boots landed with wet, echoing slaps, each step obscene in its clarity. Doors slammed like gunshots. Chickens flapped and scraped and shrieked in feathers rather than noise. The absence of voices did not soften the world. It sharpened it, carving every accidental sound into something cruel. Above it all loomed the bell tower, dark with dew, its stones sweating despite the cold, its bronze throat still warm from hours of ringing that no one remembered asking for. The bell had rung through the night as it always had, marking hours that most people slept through and few ever questioned. Yet this time the sound had lingered, stretching longer than memory allowed, tolls bleeding into one another until time itself felt bruised. Those who woke before dawn reported dreams filled with pressure rather than images, a sensation of something pressing against the inside of the skull, as if a word too large to speak had been forced inward instead. They woke with jaws clenched, tongues numb, voices gone. By afternoon, it was no longer one baker or one woman. Whole sentences collapsed before reaching the air. Mouths opened in prayer and closed again in panic. The church filled with bodies rather than sound, wooden pews creaking under the weight of people who could not cry out. The priest raised his hands and delivered a sermon to himself, lips moving with furious precision while the congregation watched, helpless, as meaning drowned silently in the space between them. The bell tower watched it all. Its shadow cut the square in half, long and deliberate, pointing nowhere and everywhere at once. Those who passed beneath it felt a pressure in the ears, a subtle pull, as if something inside them leaned upward in response. Children clutched their throats without knowing why. Dogs refused to bark, hackles raised, eyes fixed on the dark slit of the belfry above. When night approached again, no one asked whether the bell would ring. They only waited, counting heartbeats in a town that had already begun to forget the sound of its own name. The bell had always rung at night, but only recently had it learned to linger. What once marked hours now seemed to stretch them, pulling darkness taut across the town until morning arrived thin and exhausted. The sexton felt it first in his arms. The rope resisted release, fibers biting into his palms with a warmth that had nothing to do with friction. Each night he told himself he would stop sooner, yet each night his hands betrayed him, pulling longer, slower, as though obeying a pressure that rose from the tower itself rather than from any conscious will. The sound changed as the nights lengthened. It thickened, losing its clean arc, spreading low and wide across the rooftops like fog that could not lift. Windows trembled without shattering. Sleep became shallow and uneven, filled with a sense of compression, as if dreams were being packed too tightly together. The bell no longer felt like a voice announcing time. It felt like a mouth chewing something dense and reluctant, grinding echoes until they collapsed inward. Each toll arrived heavier than the last, not louder, but fuller, burdened, as though it carried weight instead of sound. The sexton noticed that silence followed him even after he left the tower. His footsteps echoed sharply, but his breathing felt distant, delayed. When he tried to hum on his walk home, the tune vanished between chest and lips, leaving only a faint vibration behind his teeth. He tasted metal then, copper and old blood, and found the sensation lingering no matter how much water he drank. The next morning, he woke with a jaw so stiff he could barely open it, and when he did, the prayer he attempted collapsed into nothing, as if it had never learned how to exist. Parish records began to reflect what the streets already knew. Ink traced patterns that no one wanted to acknowledge. After nights when the ringing ended early, one or two villagers failed to speak come dawn. Their names were circled, annotated with careful uncertainty, as if the scribe feared committing fully to the fact of it. After longer nights, entire households were marked, families waking mute, mouths forming frantic, silent shapes that resembled prayer only in posture. The pages grew dense with marginal notes, small corrections squeezed between lines, a growing anxiety trapped in looping script. The bell tower itself changed subtly, in ways that were difficult to describe but impossible to ignore. The stone remained intact, yet dampness clung to it even in dry weather, beating along the mortar like sweat. Birds that once nested in the crevices abandoned it entirely, leaving behind only feathers plastered to the walls as if pressed there by an unseen hand. Inside the tower, the air felt compressed, heavy enough to push back against the lungs. Climbing the steps induced a pressure behind the eyes, a dull ache that pulsed in time with the bell's memory, even when it was still. Those who ascended reported a sound beneath the sound, a low vibration that continued after the ringing stopped. It was not audible so much as felt, settling into bones, lingering in joints. The bell itself bore new marks, faint lines spidering across its bronze surface. They were not cracks yet, but suggestions of them, stress traced delicately as veins. When touched, the metal felt warmer than it should have, holding heat long after the night air had cooled. As weeks passed, silence became unevenly distributed. Some lost their voices entirely, others retained fragments. A cough without sound, a laugh that shook the body but produced nothing. The town learned to read faces with a new urgency, scanning mouths and eyes for meaning that sound no longer carried. Gestures grew exaggerated, desperate. Yet even movement felt delayed, as though the absence of voice had unmoored something essential, leaving bodies a fraction of a moment behind themselves. The church attempted intervention without understanding. Candles were lit in excess, wax pooling thickly at the altar. Incense choked the air, its sweetness unable to mask the metallic undertone that had begun to cling to everything. The bell was blessed again and again, holy water hissing faintly when it struck the bronze, evaporating too quickly to be natural. Each ritual ended the same way, with the bell ringing longer that night, as if offended by the attention, as if asserting a claim. The sexton's dreams grew narrow and claustrophobic. He dreamt not of images, but of compression, of words folded until they lost meaning, of prayers packed so tightly together they formed a single, suffocating mass. He woke each morning with his tongue numb, his throat sore, and a certainty that something inside the tower was counting, measuring nights not by hours, but by accumulation. When he tried to write what he felt, the words came out thin and evasive, refusing to hold the weight of his fear. Outside, the town adapted in small, unsettling ways. Markets grew louder in all the wrong places, coins clattering aggressively, crates slammed with unnecessary force. Silence in human mouths seemed to demand compensation elsewhere. Children stamped their feet when they played, boards were dragged rather than lifted, doors were thrown open instead of pushed. It was as though the town itself resisted quiet, yet could not reclaim what it had lost. At night, windows glowed longer than they once had. Sleep was avoided, delayed, treated with suspicion. Those who stayed awake swore the bell sounded different to them, less like a call and more like a pull, a low gravity that bent attention upward. Even when it did not ring, people felt it, a phantom toll pressing against the skull, reminding them that sound was no longer something freely given, but something taken, stored, and withheld. The parish ledger filled steadily, pages rustling softly even when untouched. Ink bled deeper into the paper than before, letters thickening as if absorbing moisture from the air. The pattern became undeniable, yet no decree followed, no band strong enough to reach the rope at night. The bell had learned patience. It no longer needed to ring endlessly. It rang just long enough to remind the town of what it was owed, and each morning, more voices failed to answer the day. By the second winter, silence became a condition rather than a shock, something endured rather than questioned. It settled into the town like an illness that no longer caused panic because it no longer surprised. People woke expecting the absence, mouths opening out of habit rather than hope, breath fogging the air where words should have been. The church filled each morning with bowed heads and open lips, rows of faces straining toward heaven, while the air itself seemed to tremble with intentions that never arrived. Prayers formed perfectly in the mind and died perfectly in the throat, collapsing inward with a familiar, private violence. The lack of voices changed posture before it changed belief. Shoulders slumped. Necks craned forward as if everyone were perpetually listening for something just beyond reach. Hands replaced speech, moving constantly, nervously, carving meaning into the air with increasing urgency. Yet even gestures began to feel insufficient, delayed, stripped of their authority. Meaning thinned. Frustration curdled into something heavier, something quieter. Anger learned to live without sound. The bell tower, meanwhile, had changed in ways that could no longer be dismissed as imagination. Its stone walls sweated even in frost, beads of moisture forming along the mortar and running downward like slow tears. When the sun struck it, steam rose faintly, carrying a smell that did not belong to weather or age, a tang of metal and old breath. The tower loomed darker than before, its shadow heavier, falling across the square like a lid pressed down too firmly. The bell itself bore thin fractures now, hairline cracks spreading like veins across its bronze surface. They traced no obvious pattern, branching and rejoining as though mapping pressure rather than damage. Up close, the metal seemed strained, swollen in places, subtly distorted, as if something inside pressed outward without ever finding release. The clapper hung slightly off-center, not by design, but by gradual insistence, nudged aside by forces that had nothing to do with gravity. Those who climbed the tower did so less frequently as winter deepened, but those who returned carried the same marks. Pressure in the ears that lingered long after descent. A metallic taste on the tongue that no food could erase. Some described a sensation of fullness behind the eyes, as if their skulls were packed too tightly, thoughts crowding against one another without space to breathe. A few reported hearing something that was not sound, a vibration that moved through teeth and bone, present even when the bell was still. Inside the tower, the air felt wrong. It resisted movement, clung to skin, made breathing feel like an effort of will rather than instinct. Frost formed in strange patterns along the stone, not delicate or crystalline but thick and smeared, as if wiped on by a careless hand. When touched, it melted immediately, leaving behind dampness and the faintest residue, a grayish film that stained the fingers and smelled faintly of iron. The town adapted because it had no choice. Commerce continued in a rough, inefficient silence. Bargains were struck with nods and numbers scratched into dirt. Disputes escalated quickly without the release of shouting, faces reddening, veins standing out, bodies straining under the weight of unsaid accusations. Violence became clumsy and sudden, breaking out where words once might have slowed it. Bruises replaced arguments. Blood replaced explanation. Children fared the worst. Too young to remember a time before the bell's hunger, they grew into the absence as if it were natural. Their mouths opened and closed in play without sound, laughter reduced to shaking shoulders and wide, soundless grins. Some developed habits of noise-making that bypassed the voice entirely, snapping sticks, clapping stones together, stamping feet until floors trembled. Others grew quiet in a deeper way, withdrawing inward, expressions flattening, eyes distant, as if something essential had never been given to them at all. The church attempted to impose order through ritual intensified to excess. Services stretched for hours, bodies kneeling until joints screamed silently in protest. Candles burned constantly, their smoke layering the ceiling with soot that thickened week by week. Incense hung heavy, cloying, unable to mask the underlying metallic scent that had begun to permeate the building. Holy texts were copied obsessively, page after page filled with prayers no one could speak, words preserved as if preservation alone might be enough. The bell rang less frequently now, but when it did, the effect was unmistakable. The sound was shorter, denser, as though compressed. It no longer rolled across the town, it pressed down into it. Windows rattled briefly, then fell still. People froze where they stood, hands half raised, eyes wide, as if bracing against an impact that never fully arrived. Afterward, the silence felt thicker than before, weighted, deliberate. The parish ledger became an object of unease. Its pages grew stiff, edges curling despite the dry cold. Ink bled slightly, letters darkening over time rather than fading. Entries grew more detailed, tracking not just who had lost their voice, but when, how quickly, and after how long a night of ringing. Margins filled with symbols and shorthand that no one remembered inventing. At times, the book seemed warmer than the surrounding air, its leather cover soft beneath the hand, as though it, too, retained something. Rumors spread without sound, carried through glances and gestures, through patterns of avoidance and attention. People began to walk wide arcs around the tower's shadow. Windows facing it stayed shuttered even at midday. No one lingered beneath it longer than necessary. Animals avoided the square entirely. Horses balked, refusing to pass through, eyes rolling white, breath coming fast and loud in the quiet. The most disturbing change was not the loss of voices, but the sense that something was being organized. Silence no longer felt random. It felt sorted, distributed with care. Those who had lost their voices earliest often experienced something else in its place. A constant internal murmur, a pressure that suggested words still existed, but somewhere inaccessible, stacked tightly together. They slept poorly, waking with clenched jaws and aching temples, as if they had been speaking all night without knowing it. By the heart of winter, the bell tower no longer felt like part of the town's architecture. It felt like an organ, something alive but not human, performing a function no one had consented to. Snow accumulated unevenly around its base, melting in a wide, damp ring that never froze completely. The ground there remained soft and dark, smelling of old water and rust. Silence had stopped being the absence of something. It had become a presence. It pressed into rooms, into bodies, into thought itself. And high above, behind sweating stone and fractured bronze, it gathered patiently, word by word, waiting for a release that would never come. The town council ordered the ringing to stop with signatures pressed hard enough to tear the paper. Seals were stamped. Notices were nailed to doors with excessive force. The decree was carried through the square and up the tower steps by men who avoided looking at the bell, as if sight itself might be interpreted as consent. The rope was tied off in daylight, knotted tight, secured with iron hooks meant to make disobedience impossible. By evening, the town waited in a silence that felt tentative, fragile, like a held breath that could not last. Night fell anyway. It always did. And with it came the sound of fibers tightening. No hand touched the rope when it began to strain. The knot shuddered once, then again, as if testing its restraints, would groan softly in the ceiling beams. The rope pulled against its anchors with the slow insistence of muscle remembering a task. When it moved, it did so without urgency, inch by deliberate inch, fibers creaking like joints under strain. The bell answered not with reluctance, but with devotion. Its first toll rolled outward, compressed and thick, as though pushed through too narrow a space. The town felt it immediately. Bodies stiffened in beds and doorways. Animals panicked in their stalls. The sound did not travel far, yet it seemed to settle everywhere at once, pressing downward rather than outward. Each successive toll arrived heavier, fuller, dragging something invisible behind it. The bell no longer marked time. It consumed it, pulling minutes inward, packing them together until the night grew dense and difficult to endure. The longer it rang, the quieter the town became. Not suddenly, but steadily, like a tide withdrawing grain by grain. Any voices that had survived this long faltered and failed. Even children cried without sound now, faces contorting with the violence of grief while the world remained indifferent. Tears fell loudly, splashing against floors and sleeves, obscene in their clarity. Prayers collapsed into airless shapes, lips moving faster as if speed alone might force sound into existence. Inside the church, candles trembled as the bell rang, flames bending inward toward themselves. Wax pooled and hardened in strange formations, twisted and layered, resembling folded tongues. The air thickened, growing warm despite the cold outside, carrying the metallic tang that had become inseparable from breath. Those who knelt felt pressure building behind their eyes, a sensation of being filled from within, as though something sought space where none remained. The council convened again by lantern light, faces pale, hands trembling over ledgers and seals. They wrote orders they knew would fail, their script uneven, ink blotted by sweat. Guards were posted at the tower, yet none remained there long. Men assigned to watch the rope reported a sense of vertigo, a pull in the chest that drew their attention upward until their thoughts unraveled. Some descended shaking, jaws locked tight. Others refused the stairs altogether after a single night, crossing themselves repeatedly with frantic precision. Attempts were made to cut the rope. Blades dulled too quickly, metal scraping uselessly against fibers that resisted separation. Each cut left behind a faint vibration in the tool, a humming that traveled up the arm and lodged behind the eyes. The rope frayed but did not break, strands recoiling subtly, tightening further, as if angered by the attempt. The bell rang longer after each intervention. Nights stretched into something indistinct, hours bleeding together until dawn arrived exhausted and gray. Morning brought no relief. The silence that followed ringing felt deeper than before, weighted with accumulation. People moved as though submerged, limbs heavy, thoughts sluggish. Writing became difficult, letters blurred, ink spread beyond its lines. Records grew dense with corrections and marginalia, the archive swelling with attempts to explain what no longer obeyed explanation. In the archives, a final note appeared beside the bell's inventory, written shakily by a hand that did not expect to finish the sentence. It described the sound not as loud, but as thick, crowded, almost angry. The words struggled to contain the sensation, looping back on themselves, as if the writer were fighting compression even on the page. The note suggested that too much human breath had been forced into one bronze body, that the bell had been overfilled, swollen with voices that could not disperse. The bell itself reflected this burden. Its fractures widened imperceptibly with each night, hairline cracks deepening into lines that caught candlelight and refused to let it go. When the bell rang now, those lines vibrated visibly, shivering like skin under strain. The metal surface grew uneven, subtly warped, as if pressed outward from within. The clapper struck with less swing and more impact, hitting closer to the same spot each time, worrying the bronze like a tooth grinding against bone. The tower groaned under the ritual. Mortar crumbled in small, unnoticed showers. Dust fell in thin sheets, coating the steps. The smell inside grew stronger, a mix of damp stone and old iron, layered with something that resembled breath held too long. Those who dared ascend felt it in their chests first, a tightness that made inhalation shallow and exhalation unsatisfying. Thoughts fragmented. Memories felt compressed, difficult to retrieve, as though something were sorting through them without permission. Outside, the town ceased resisting in any meaningful way. Silence was no longer an event, it was infrastructure. Lives reorganized around it. Work continued through gesture and routine. Grief lost its public form and retreated inward, fermenting. The absence of sound did not bring peace. It brought a constant, internal pressure, a sense of something unfinished, something still gathering. The bell rang because it had learned how. It rang because the rope remembered the tension of hands that had pulled it for generations, and because the bronze remembered the shape of sound. It rang because no decree could reach it where it was now, swollen with accumulation, bound not to orders but to habit and hunger. Each night it took a little more, not violently, but faithfully, fulfilling a function no one had named until it was too late. By the time dawn followed one of the longest nights yet, the town woke to a silence so complete it felt engineered. Breath moved, blood flowed, hearts beat, yet something essential had been archived elsewhere. The bell hung above it all, cracked and sweating, quiet at last, not because it had been stopped, but because it was full. When the bell finally broke, it did not shatter, it split. The moment arrived without warning, without ritual, without the dignity of anticipation. Night had settled into one of its quieter intervals, the kind that followed excessive ringing, when the town lay flattened by exhaustion. The rope hung still. The tower breathed damply. Then the bronze gave way with a soundless violence that was felt rather than heard, a sudden yielding that tore along its side like flesh opening under pressure too long endured. A jagged mouth appeared where no mouth should have been. The crack ran crooked and wide, edges peeled back, metal warped outward as if something inside had forced its way free and failed at the last instant. From that opening came not noise, but force. A wave passed through the tower and spilled outward, invisible yet undeniable. Candles across the town guttered and collapsed, flames pressed flat and extinguished in the same breathless instant. Birds tore themselves from sleep and fled the rooftops in blind panic, scattering into the dark sky as if pursued by something they could not escape. People woke clutching their chests, hands pressed to throats, eyes wide with the certainty that something irreversible had occurred. The ringing stopped forever in that moment. Not gradually, not uncertainly. It ended as if cut away from the world entirely, leaving behind a vacuum that made the absence of sound feel like relief. The town exhaled together for the first time in months, a collective loosening of bodies that had forgotten what release felt like. Morning brought celebration. Not loud celebration, for there were no voices left to shape it, but movement spoke where mouths could not. Windows were thrown open. Doors stood wide. People gathered in the square beneath the tower's shadow, faces lifted, eyes wet with something like gratitude. Hands clasped shoulders. Heads bowed. The bell hung silent above them, its cracked side dark and unmistakable, a visible ending that required no explanation. The curse, they believed, had ended. Days passed without ringing. Nights fell gently, unmarked, unclaimed. Sleep returned in full cycles rather than fractured intervals. The pressure behind eyes faded. Jaws loosened. For the first time in memory, the town existed without the constant threat of sound being taken again. The bell tower remained untouched, avoided but no longer feared. Its silence felt earned. But voices did not return. At first, hope made allowances. Throats were sore. Muscles had forgotten their work. Time would restore what had been lost. People waited patiently, attempting speech in private moments, mouths opening cautiously, breath shaped carefully, as if sound were a fragile thing that might break under force. Nothing emerged. Silence remained lodged in throats, permanent and raw, scraping with every attempted word. The realization arrived unevenly, cruel in its persistence. Laughter without sound grew hollow. Weeping became exhausting. Songs remembered only in the body lost their meaning without voice to anchor them. Parents pressed their foreheads to their children's, trying to feel some echo of what once passed between them through words. It was not enough. Physicians examined throats and tongues, finding no damage that could explain the absence. Muscles worked. Breath flowed. The machinery of speech remained intact, yet something essential was missing, as if the final connection between thought and air had been severed. Writing increased. Charcoal and ink became precious commodities. Yet written words felt inadequate, slow, incapable of carrying urgency or comfort. Meaning bled out between lines. The bell tower loomed above all of it, unchanged and undeniable. The crack in the bronze darkened with age, its edges dulling, yet the opening remained, a mouth forever frozen mid-confession. When wind passed through the tower, it made no sound, but people felt it brush their skin like a memory. Some swore they could sense movement inside the bell, a subtle internal shift, as if whatever had been held there had settled rather than escaped. Attempts were made to remove the bell. Ropes were attached. Pulleys were assembled. Men strained in unison, bodies bent, muscles screaming silently with effort. The bell did not move. It felt heavier than its size allowed, as if weighted by something beyond metal. When pressure increased, the ropes frayed and snapped, fibers recoiling with violent suddenness. No one was injured, but the message was clear. The bell would remain. Over time, anger replaced relief. The town had been freed from ringing only to be trapped in permanent quiet. The bell had taken and then stopped, leaving nothing behind. It hung above them like a sealed wound that refused to heal, a reminder that the end of suffering did not guarantee restoration. Some residents began to avoid the square entirely, rerouting their lives to escape the sight of it. Others lingered beneath it for hours, staring upward, mouths working uselessly, as if daring it to answer. Children born after the break learned a world without sound from the start. Their cries moved bodies but carried no noise. They learned to communicate through touch and movement alone, never knowing what had been taken from their parents. Those parents watched them with a mix of grief and resignation, realizing that silence was no longer an affliction but an inheritance. The church rang no bells. Time was kept through shadow and habit. Festivals passed unmarked by music. Funerals proceeded without eulogy, the dead lowered into earth accompanied only by the scrape of tools and the shuffling of feet. Grief became internal, compact, difficult to share. The town endured, but it did not recover. At night, some claimed the bell glowed faintly along its crack, a dull internal sheen like embers buried beneath ash. Others felt pressure return in dreams, a familiar compression, as if voices still existed somewhere nearby, packed too tightly to emerge. People woke with clenched jaws and aching throats, convinced they had been speaking all night without sound. The ringing had ended. The curse, if it could be called that, had fulfilled itself. The bell had released its pressure and found peace. The town had not. Silence, once feared as an approaching threat, now defined every breath. And above them, fixed in place and forever quiet, the broken bell remained, not as a warning, but as a monument to an exchange that could never be undone. Years later, when the tower was dismantled stone by stone, no one expected discovery, only closure. The town had thinned by then, families drifting away in search of places where silence felt less deliberate. The bell tower stood abandoned, its shadow no longer feared, merely endured, a relic of something no one could explain and no one wished to remember aloud. Moss climbed its lower stones. Mortar crumbled at a touch. The structure no longer resisted removal. It seemed almost relieved to be taken apart. The work began slowly, cautiously, as if the tower might object if rushed. Stones were lowered by rope, stacked carefully, counted out of habit rather than necessity. The interior smelled old, not of rot, but of containment, like a sealed room opened after too long. Dust rose in soft clouds that clung to skin and clothing, leaving behind a faint metallic tang. No birds nested there. No insects lived within the cracks. The space had been emptied of small life long before the bell had broken. When the bell itself was finally reached, it resisted not with force, but with weight. The bronze was dull now, its surface darkened and uneven, the old fracture still visible along its side like a healed scar that never smoothed. Ropes groaned as it was lowered inch by inch, workers bracing their bodies in silence, breath loud in their ears. The bell did not ring. It made no sound at all, even when it struck wood, even when it scraped stone. It had learned that lesson too well. It was only once the bell lay on its side, mouth exposed to daylight for the first time in memory, that someone noticed the lining. The interior was not smooth. It was layered. Thin sheets clung to the bronze walls, stacked tightly together, pale and brittle, arranged with obsessive density. At first they were mistaken for residue, for some byproduct of age and damp, but the pattern was too deliberate. Each layer was uniform in thickness, delicate as paper, fused lightly to the one beneath it. They lined the bell from lip to crown, narrowing inward, an endless accumulation pressed into every curve. When the first layer was scraped loose, it did not crumble into dust. It peeled away reluctantly, tearing with a faint resistance that could be felt through the tool. In the light, the fragment broke apart into shapes too specific to be natural. Curves, hooks, slashes. forms that suggested letters without belonging to any language that had ever been written or spoken. They were not symbols of meaning, but of attempt. Each fragment seemed poised on the edge of articulation, frozen just before becoming sound. More layers were removed. Hundreds. Thousands. They came away in brittle sheets that cracked and fragmented, filling the air with pale debris that clung to hair and skin. Workers grew uneasy. Some felt pressure behind the eyes. Others developed headaches that worsened the longer they labored. One man dropped his tool and pressed his hands to his throat, eyes wide, convinced for a moment that something inside him had shifted. As the interior was stripped, the smell intensified. Not decay, not metal alone, but something unmistakably human. The scent of breath held too long, of crowded air with nowhere to go. The bell's hollow had not been empty. It had been full. Records were consulted again, desperate for context that might blunt the weight of the discovery. Inventories listed weight, material, date of casting, all meticulously preserved. Nowhere was there mention of lining. Nowhere was there acknowledgement of accumulation. The bell had been treated as an object, not a container. The realization arrived slowly, and then all at once. The bell had not eaten voices to destroy them. It had stored them. Each night of ringing had pulled sound inward rather than releasing it. Each word spoken beneath its shadow, each prayer whispered, each cry swallowed by sleep, had been drawn upward and packed inside, pressed flat and layered upon itself. Human noise, hoarded patiently, compressed until it lost individuality, reduced to shape without voice. The bell had grown heavier not with metal, but with breath. When it finally split, it had not released what it held. It had merely failed to contain it further. The pressure had escaped, but the contents remained, stripped of the possibility of return. Sound, once taken, could not be given back. It could only be kept or lost. The town's silence was not an absence. It was displacement. As the final layers were removed, the bronze beneath appeared altered. The metal bore faint impressions, shallow grooves that mirrored the shapes peeled away, as if the bell itself had been rewritten from the inside. It was no longer just an instrument. It had become a record. The workers finished their task without celebration. The bell was dismantled, cut into sections, hauled away to be melted down elsewhere. Yet even then, something resisted erasure. Those who handled the bronze later reported strange inconsistencies. The metal behaved unpredictably, melting unevenly, cooling too fast or too slow. Finished pieces carried a dullness no polish could remove. Some claimed to feel vibrations when they touched it, a phantom hum without sound. The town watched the tower's absence with mixed relief and unease. The square felt exposed without it, as if a familiar weight had been lifted only to reveal how much it had been carrying. Silence did not leave with the bell. It remained lodged in throats, permanent and raw, shaping lives that had learned to function without voice. Children grew old never knowing speech. Stories became gestures passed down through repetition. Emotion learned to live in eyes and hands. The punishment endured quietly, without spectacle, without the comfort of expression. The bell, emptied at last, learned what it meant to be silent. Not the silence of lack, but of completion. It had finished its work. It had taken everything it could hold, and then some. Relief belonged to it alone. The people were left behind to carry what could not be returned, moving through generations with voices intact in thought, but forever denied release. And in the absence of sound, they learned the final truth the bell had taught without mercy, that silence, once stored elsewhere, does not vanish. It changes hands.